Welcome. I'm glad you could make it out this morning. Over the past several weeks here at Nexus, we've been exploring loneliness and the feelings of being adrift and those connections with faith. And Brad, at the beginning of the series on Adrift, he brought four terms or four vocabulary words to loneliness, and they're restlessness, rootlessness, alienation, and fantasy. And we've been exploring these terms and how they connect with faith and how they invite us deeper into our loneliness. They accompany our loneliness, and sometimes they invite us out of our loneliness. And Katie did a week on rootless and restlessness, and it was fantastic, and I'm honored to be able to share the stage with them. And so when Brad offered me these four terms, and he was like, what do we want to talk about here at Nexus? He brought up the word fantasy. It felt like a puzzle piece clicked into place for my own understanding in my current stage in life. For me, loneliness or fantasy has become a huge source in my loneliness, and today I want to kind of have a personal exploration of loneliness, fantasy, and faith, and it's going to get a little weird. We're going to get inside my brain, which, as you're about to see, is a strange place. I want to explore one of the most intriguing fantasies that I've had over the past year or so and how it's affected me. So it starts with my girlfriend, Deandra. Don't look at her, please. And it's all about her jumping into my arms. And here's what happened. My girlfriend and I, we'd been dating for several months, and then I said, I love you, and she was like, I'm not ready to say that. You're insane. And I was like, you're right. But so she would respond with things like, you mean a lot to me, I really love being in this relationship, or something like that. And we kind of had that game for a little bit until she said it. But until she said it, this fantasy would come in my mind. And she would come to my place and stay over in the guest room. And so I would kiss her goodnight and be like, okay, I love you, babe. And she'd be like, you mean a lot to me, I love being in this relationship, something like that. And then I would leave. And this is where the fantasy starts. And it's weird. Well, you'll find out. So I would be leaving the room, and it takes about 12 steps from her bedroom to my bedroom. And I would be kind of like going over. And then at about step 4, I would be lifting my foot and then I would imagine I would hear the doorknob behind me turn a little bit. And I'd be like, and there was a couple times where I legitimately was like, but I would turn, and the door would swing open, and bright light would stream into the darkness of the hallway, and out of the light, she would run and leap high into the air, and I, like Patrick Swayze, would catch her as though she was baby and hold her in this space, and we would make eye contact, and I know what would be about to happen. She was going to say it. So I would slowly bring her down, and then she would whisper it, I love you too. And at that moment, in the distance, my neighbors would launch off fireworks. I don't know why, but they did. Fireworks streamed into the air, and lights would shoot into the darkness of the hallway, and we would embrace and kiss, and we would fall into euphoria and joy, and then we would both go to our separate bedrooms and fall asleep in happiness. And I can't tell you how many times this fantasy actually happened. Too many to count. And there was one time where I was going, and I almost made it to my room, and then I heard the doorknob turn, and I was like, this is it. She's going to do it. And she's like, forgot the lip trap, and just went past me, and my heart just sank. It was terrible. But the reason I bring this up, this fantasy is ridiculous, and I completely understand that. It's a shallow, strange, weird fantasy. And yet, in the 12 steps that it took me from getting from her room to mine, I would go from elation and joy and happiness and love to being in a relationship to, why haven't you jumped into my arms like baby? Why haven't you said I love you this way? And I would toss and turn in my bed until I could fall asleep. And most nights, I couldn't fall asleep, and so I would go to another form of fantasy. I would turn on Netflix and self-medicate on episode after episode of how life should be. Of when people kiss in the rain, of when people steal blue French horns, and when baby jumps into the arms of Patrick Swayze, and you know it's love, because those are the big moments. And maybe I'm being a total drama king, the shoe very accurately fits, but I would say that the majority of us, if we're being very honest, we feel caught up in worlds of fantasy, in the constant questions of what if, or why hasn't, or when will, or why didn't. Each one of us, we have these recurring fantasies, these dreams that they never happen. Situations that we play out in our mind again and again, longing for those types of connections. We feel let down by our imaginary worlds for not becoming real. Frustrated by the fact that our friends and our family aren't like the ones in our fantasies, which for me aren't like the ones in television. For me, my largest source of fantasy does not come from being restless or rootless or alienated, but instead, they all stem from my fantasies. Fantasies that inevitably don't come true and never will. Fantasies that paint the way I see the world and relationships, and fantasies that have the capacity to drive me farther and farther from human community and connection. And so I began wrestling with this question of why does my fantasy lead me in this direction, and how does it correlate with my faith? And I began looking in Scripture, trying to find a place that would help me make sense of this, and I stumbled across a strange direction, let's say. In Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus is kind of establishing the community that will follow him for the next several years, and he kind of begins laying out all these very interesting teachings about, there's the Beatitudes, and then he gets to this section where there's this refrain, and he says, "You have heard it said, but I tell you." And so he says, like, "You've heard it said, do not murder, but I say something else." And then he says, "You've heard it said, do not commit adultery. But I tell you, everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery in his heart." And this is going somewhere, I swear. Because what does lustful intent mean? As I reflected on this verse for a while, I was like, what is this really getting at? Is there a certain look, or is there something about it? But I would say if we translated this verse into more modern language, it would be, even if you engage in fantasies of sexual encounters, you've already committed adultery in your heart, which has frustrated me. This passage has frustrated me for years because why does it matter? Why does what I'm imagining about or fantasizing about or the world inside my mind matter? How does it affect me in any way? I mean, it doesn't hurt anyone. It's only in between my mind. But I think Dumbledore has something to say about this. In the 7th book of Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, Harry is having this interaction with his Professor Dumbledore in this mind palace that I'm not going to give away anything more than that. He's having this moment with Dumbledore, and he says, "Professor, is this all real, or is it just happening inside my head?" To which Dumbledore wisely responds, "Of course it's happening in your head. But why should that mean it's not real?" Of course it's happening in your head, Harry, but why should that mean it's not real? And I think that in a way, this is what Jesus' teaching on lustful intents points to, on lustful fantasies and imaginations. If I were there and I said, "Jesus, I can understand, I can get behind not committing adultery, it can ruin families, it can destroy communities, but really, like fantasy, it's just in my head, it's just a work of imagination." And I think Jesus, in the same vein, would say, of course it's in your head, but why should that mean it's not real? Of course it's in your mind and your fantasies, but your fantasies have so much weight and power for how you see and perceive the world. The things and ways you fantasize about directly paint the way you live. Fantasize about a sexual encounter long enough, and sooner or later you will only begin to see people as sexual objects or opportunities or conquests. You will quickly see them as less than human, is the danger in the role of fantasy. Our fantasies are heavy. They paint our world, and if we let them, they can be extremely corrosive and destructive. And in my own life, I've begun to feel this in kind of 3 main ways. The first one, as I've already highlighted, is my fantasies are constantly letting me down. My girlfriend still has not jumped into my arms like baby, but she's 5'1" and does not have a 3-foot vertical to make it. But I constantly fantasize about it, and it affects me enough. Or a while ago, Deandra, we were talking about, I was like, "Babe, we should do this 100 relationship question quiz." And she's like, "Yeah, but you're not going to get the answers you want," which is really, you're not going to get the answers that you've already fantasized about because I cheated and read all the questions and thought of my own answers and the ones that she should have. But she didn't. And I was frustrated by that, but I would say we all kind of feel this tension, right? I mean, all of us feel this at times. We imagine the way an interaction is going to go, and then a person reacts completely opposite of how we want them to. Often as I'm getting ready to hang out with friends, I'll be like, "Man, we're going to have this amazing time. We're going to go bowling, and we're going to have this meaningful conversation, and then this person's going to do this, and I'm going to respond with this like super witty conversation, and just like this intense, amazing times." And life doesn't play out that way. I wrote this blog post a while ago on the 2 times I tried to blog, and I said, I want to steal blue French horns for How I Met Your Mother fans. I want to kiss in the rain right as the heavens open up. I want every conversation to mean something every single time like it does in the movies. For everything to be exciting and meaningful and earth-shattering all the time. But life is nothing like my fantasies, and it often doesn't live up to the amazing stories I write in my mind. People don't follow the script I keep giving them. Is it all in my head? Yes. Does that make its effects on me any less real? Another way is that fantasies constantly are painting the world I see, or painting the way I see the world. I mean, how often do we become trapped in negative cycles in relationships only because of the way we fantasize? I imagine that my dad will respond negatively in an interaction, and so before the interaction begins, I instigate aggressively or defensively. I'm serving a table at work, and I think they're going to be bad tippers, so I give them less of my time and attention. I imagine that a person doesn't like me very much, and so I respond unkindly. And then my fantasy is affirmed as a self-fulfilling prophecy when, due to my aggressive attitude, the person responds in kind. Due to my lack of attention at a table, they tip me poorly. And due to my unfairness, they are unfair to me. It's these little things. I constantly am writing the script of how other people are going to respond and live that, and then it comes back and hits me again. It constantly paints the way I'm seeing the world. It's the glasses that I wear, you could say. Is it all in my head? Yes. Does that make it any less real? And the final one that I've felt the most is that fantasy is constantly working as a place of false connection or escape. Last week, Brad talked about this idea that all of us as humans, we long for deep and meaningful connections. We long to be in meaningful relationships, and yet we are extremely afraid of the rejection that may come. All relationships take work. They demand so much from us. And instead of often going full-fledged into them, I often find myself running away into worlds of fantasy, fiction, and imagination. I mitigate my feelings of connection to characters I read in books or watch in TV or movies. Why do I need to hang out with my friends when I can do it in New York in the 1990s every single Monday night on Netflix? Why do I need to have a deep and meaningful conversation when I can watch one and feel the emotions of it? In Genesis 2, a verse we've gone to a lot during the series, it says, "It is not good for man and woman to be alone." And yet I would say we are constantly trying to get out of that and mitigate the feelings of loneliness. We are designed for human connection, and yet we're trying to find ways to supplement that, whether it's through Instagram or Facebook or Twitter. We have just enough of a mitigation of the feelings. Fantasy works as the perfect escape as long as I have a steady drip of the IV of Netflix going, as long as the book doesn't end, as long as there's another episode after that. Once, after a breakup, I drove home, and it was still early in the day, and nobody else was home, and I probably watched 20 episodes on Netflix, which is a testament to who I am, but I was watching Netflix, and I was like, everything was happy and okay, and I didn't have to deal with reality, and then that dirty 19-second counter would come, and I had lost the controller, and I would try to find the next button as quickly as I could before reality set in again. Self-medicating on Netflix in order to not having to deal with real human connection. Is it all in my head? Is it all a work of fiction and fantasy? Yes, but does that make its effects any less real? Jesus' message on lustful fantasies points to the danger in all fantasies. They are just in our heads, and yet their effects are felt deeply. They can drive us farther and farther from human connections. They can be huge sources of destruction if we allow them. And I've noticed this in my place, and I'm guessing that many of us have felt this as well. So what do we do with this? Do we simply push and expunge imagination and fantasy in every way we see it? Do we close out on fiction and literature and just get it all away? I think at times the church has reacted to certain fantasies or works of fiction that they see as negative and damaging, and they push them away. But I think there's a better response. In the early church, in and around the 2nd and 3rd century, Christian faith for the first time was bumping up alongside Greek philosophy and thought. And many in the church were wrestling with this practice of what do we do with this thing that comes from, for them, very evil or pagan practices? What do we do with a type of philosophy that finds itself in multiple gods and all these sorts of things? And so many in the church, they pushed it out. They said, we don't deal with it. It's wrong. It's corrupt. It's evil. But there were some in the church, like Justin the Martyr, who believed so strongly that philosophy points to God because so much of philosophy finds its source in truth. Justin argued that Jesus is described as the Logos in the book of John, which is the ultimate source of truth. And he says anything that is true or finds its source in truth is ultimately pointing to or bumping up alongside God. And this ultimately turned Greek philosophy to be one of the vital tools for the early church in sharing the message of Jesus, as well as understanding who he was more deeply. And I think this can be true of fantasy. If we allow it to be a great tool, it can also be a place of community and connection. Christianity, as much as we may not want it to be, is a faith or spirituality that must not be done alone. It requires relationship and community, and so though fantasy can take us away from that, I think it can drive us deeper into it. And I've seen this at work in many ways in my life as well. C.S. Lewis writes on fantasy, and he says this: fantasy at its best can do more. It can give us experiences we've never had, and thus, instead of commenting on life, can add to it. For me, fantasy is a journey in empathy and shared experiences. Fantasy gives us this opportunity to feel and live and experience lives and worlds we would have never been able to feel before. Through fantasy, we teach ourselves to look at all of the angles, to feel all sorts of different emotions. I mean, how many times while reading a book or watching a movie have we been brought to tears? Because there's so much truth and reality at work in these works of fiction. Or how many times are we able to sympathize with the stories of the villains because we understand how human they really are? Just as our fantasies can work at dehumanizing others, imagining them as nothing more than objects, fantasy has the ability to reclaim the humanity in others, to see the image of God and raise it to new heights. Though this type of fantasy takes more work. Lewis, his quote points to this idea of it as a shared experience almost. One TED Talker, they described television as the new global campfire, the place where we gather and experience what it means to be human together, but at our own time and pace. And as humans, we need shared experiences in order to build relationships. As a server, I work at the Works in Waterloo, and I'm constantly trying to find those little places where I can build just a shallow enough connection to be meaningful. And yet those shallow connections over time will allow for a great amount of depth to grow. After we ask the questions of who are you and where do you work, most often it's what do you watch, what do you read, what fantasies are you living in, and have I experienced them as well? After sharing this talk with the guild, we spent about 20 minutes being like, oh my gosh, and this movie, and then this show, and this show, and this show, and there were people left out because they weren't sharing the same experiences as us. Is it all in our heads? Is it all the work of fiction and fantasy? Yes, but does that make the potential for connection any less real? And another interesting way that fantasy works and affects me and how I engage with community is that it's constantly confronting my own fantasies. So much of the time, fantasy can be an escape, trying to get away from life and situations. But what if fantasy isn't running away from to get away from, but instead running away from to confront reality? This one writer, he captured it beautifully, says this: I bristle whenever fantasy is characterized as escapism. It's not a very accurate way to describe it. In fact, I think that fantasy is a powerful tool for coming to understand oneself. The magic trick here, the sleight of hand, is that when you pass through the portal, you re-encounter in the fantasy world the problems you thought you left behind in the real world. Edmund, a character from Narnia, doesn't solve any of his grievances or personality disorders by going through the wardrobe. If anything, they're exacerbated and brought to crisis by his experience in Narnia. When you go to Narnia, your worries come with you. Narnia just becomes the place where you work out and try to resolve them. And I believe that in a huge way, fantasy and fiction are often God's biggest tool for confronting us in our own fantasies and fictions. And we see this in so many places in Scripture. One of them, there's the story of King David, and King David sees this woman, Bathsheba, and they sleep together. I don't know why that was so difficult for me to say. They sleep together, and then she becomes pregnant, and David's like, crap, I got to cover this up. So he kills her husband in order to kind of cover the whole thing up. And then the prophet Nathan, a prophet of God, is confronted with this. He has to go confront David with this problem. But the tough part is, how do you go up to a king and say, hey, you're not really acting on key, but you have the power to kill me? And so Nathan figures this thing out. He comes to David, and he doesn't come in guns blazing. He doesn't come in attacking. He says, David, I want to tell you a small, simple story, a simple piece of fantasy and fiction. And he tells the story of these two men, and one has many sheep and another has one. And the man with many sheep kills the guy's only sheep and serves it for dinner. Steals it in the middle of the night. And he tells this story to David, and David's just like, oh my gosh, this is terrible. And he goes over the top, almost as though knowing he's caught, but doesn't want to admit that his fantasy is coming to an end. And then Nathan responds to him, David, you are that man. One fantasy told to confront another, a work of fiction used by God as a tool of confrontation. And the intriguing thing is, Jesus takes on this same practice again and again every single time he tells parables. People ask him a question, and he doesn't say, well, this is the seemingly easy answer. As we've been wrestling with over the season here at Nexus, Jesus tells these simple little works of fiction and fantasy involving seeds and brothers and strangers, and he uses them to do these huge pieces of teaching. Like great writers like Shakespeare and many others in that line, they use fantasy to confront their own situation, but allowing an easier way. A while ago, I was watching one of my favorite shows, Doctor Who, and there's this line that the Doctor has, and he says this, he says, "I am and always will be the optimist, the hoper of far-flung hopes and the dreamer of improbable dreams." And I was watching this, and I was confronted, and I paused it, because at that time in my life, I was in no way an optimist. I am, by almost all accounts, a pessimist. I'm extremely negative when push comes to shove. I often find myself being extremely discouraging in situations like this. And I was so frustrated coming across a quote like that because it was everything I was not at the time. And this simple work of fantasy worked as a confrontation of who I was. It was this oddly spiritual moment. I took out a book and started writing and journaling, being like, I don't want to be these things. And fantasy and fiction, primarily many quotes from Doctor Who, allowed me to give voice to the feelings and struggles I was having. I long to be someone who is more of an optimist, who is encouraging, who can dream in far-flung dreams. It confronts the reality we're in by taking us out of it for just a moment. Is it all in our heads? Does that make it any less real? And lastly, this one is so important to me, fantasy becomes a source of hope. Today, when we look towards the future, it is painted with very bright, vivid destruction. Like we read books like 1984 or Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, or we watch movies like Terminator or Mockingjay, and they're all super totalitarian societies that are destructive and awful. And though we may not say we think the future is going to turn out like this, not many of us think it's going to be super great after we're gone. We just hope it's until after we're gone. But the early church, they wrote about the future in such a different way. John writes this book known as Revelation in the last book of the Bible, and it's this strange, almost acid trip fantasy of the future involving beasts with 4 heads and lions and rivers of blood and all this kind of crazy stuff. And the style of literature at the time was known as apocalyptic literature, and many other people had written in similar styles. And John writes this book, receiving a vision from God, in order to pass this to a people that were losing hope, that were feeling adrift and lonely and restless. Many were walking away from faith. They were facing persecution from their family, and the empire was beginning to press upon them. And they were struggling. And so John writes this large fantasy, though very true at times, to tell them of a time when God will win, when good defeats evil, when God defeats death and love overcomes. His goal through these works of fantasy is to give people hope in the future, to look at it and be able to live into that way. The book climaxes in this beautiful passage, and it says this, "Behold, the dwelling place of God is with man. He will dwell with them, and they will be his people, and God himself will be with them as their God, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain anymore, for the former things have passed." And until we experience what that's really like, it can only be a fantasy for us. It can only be an imagination until we fully feel what that one day will be like. And so John paints this beautiful picture and gives the church hope, saying, don't worry, one day this will end. One day things will change. This is not the end of it. Fantasy, imagination, and fiction are powerful. They have a great amount of weight in our life and faith. They can affect us in huge ways if we allow it. It can drive us farther and farther from others. It can fill us with worry and anxiety and restlessness. And yet, I'm convinced that it is vital for relationships. They teach us empathy and compassion and understanding. They offer us the chance of shared experience. They confront our lies, and they give us glimpses of hope in a day in which God wins. So what do we do with it? I've been wrestling with this question for weeks now. What do I do with these balance of fantasy, of the good and bad? I found that
quote by Tolkien, and it's so intriguing to me. He says this: "We have come from God, and inevitably the myths woven by us, our fantasies, though they contain error, will also reflect a splintered fragment of the true light, the eternal truth that is with God, indeed only by myth-making, fantasizing, you could say, only by becoming sub-creator, or creators, I think I missed an S, and inventing stories can man aspire to be the state of perfection that he knew before the fall. Our myths may be misguided, but they steer, however shakily, towards the true harbor." To me, the invitation of fantasy within faith is to become co-creators alongside God. Fantasy, if we let it, can be a giant source of destruction, of anti-creation, of rootlessness, restlessness, and alienation. But if used as a tool, as a source of creating hope, truth, and beauty, it will find its true purpose. The question of fantasy simply comes: will I create or will I destroy? Will I hope or will I worry? And I hope that together as a community we can navigate these difficult questions around fantasy. That if it becomes a source of hope and connection for our community, that together we can do amazing things to the glory of God. Amen. I'm going to pray really quick before the band starts. Yes. Father, I pray that you work within the world in our minds. That through our fantasies, you bring us hope and joy, that you can bring about deep and meaningful connections with others, that we can look to the future with hope and joy, knowing that one day you will win, and that through fantasy and fiction and literature, you can confront us with even bigger realities than we are aware of. Let us together fantasize and imagine what a community like us and our Christian faith can do in this city. Amen.